We now are about a decade into a new century and a new millennium. And it's interesting to look back at the last century and ask ourselves, what was probably the most important speech given in the last century? Now, if you were to ask that question of 100 people, probably not one of them would cite the speech that I'm going to tell you tonight was the most important speech of the last century. But I think that if you were to ask that question 10 or 15 years from now, that almost all of that 100 people will tell you that this speech is probably the most important speech of the last century. It was given on the 8th day of March in 1956 by a man named Marion King Hubbard, generally known as M. King Hubbard, to a group of oil people in San Antonio, Texas. At that time, the United States was king of oil. We were the first major industrialized nation in the world. We were pumping more oil. We were using more oil. We were exporting more oil than any other country in the world. And M. King Hubbard told this group of oil specialists that in just 14 years, by 1970, the United States would reach its maximum oil production. That no matter what they did after that, oil production in this country would fall off. That was audacious. It was unbelievable. As a matter of fact, it wasn't believed. M. King Hubbard was relegated to the lunatic fringe. How could it be that a country that had discovered this much oil was king of oil, producing more oil, consuming more oil, exporting more oil than any other country, in 14 years is going to reach its maximum production and then fall off? You know, if you stop to think about it, oil one day will run out, won't it? I started asking myself that question a lot of years ago when I was teaching school, and I taught a class in biology, and all of the publishers would send me their textbook, hoping that I would use it in my class so they could sell it to the members of the class. And I remember I was asking myself the question, you know, oil can't be forever. When will there be a problem? Next year? 10 years? 100 years? Maybe it's 1,000 years. I had no idea. I had no idea when this crisis would occur. But obviously there had to be a time in which oil would run out. And if there's a time in which oil will run out, there has to be a time when you've reached your maximum ability to produce oil. Well, the chart that I have here shows what happened. He made that prediction here in 1956. We were here. He said in 1970, that's the peak up there, that we would reach our maximum oil production. This chart shows where that oil was coming from. From Texas, from the rest of the United States, from natural gas liquids. And then we made two big oil discoveries. He hadn't included Alaska, and he hadn't included the Gulf of Mexico. You can see Alaska there, just a little blip in the slide down the other side of Hubbard's Peak. And there you could see the fabled Gulf of Mexico in yellow there, the fabled Gulf of Mexico oil discoveries. It hardly made a difference, did it? The United States now produces about half the oil that it produced in 1970. And that's in spite of the fact of finding oil that M. King Hubbard did not include in his prediction. He included the lower 48. He did not include Alaska. He did not include the Gulf of Mexico. But in spite of finding a fair amount of oil there, today we still produce half the oil we did in 1970. Now, by 1980, if you look on the charts, by 1980 you could look back and you would say, gee, M. King Hubbard was right, wasn't he? The United States did reach its maximum oil production 10 years ago. Wow. What that means, of course, is that won't the world sometime reach its maximum oil production? How could you argue that the United States is not a microcosm of the world? If the United States reached its maximum oil production in 1970, when would the world reach its maximum oil production? As a matter of fact, M. King Hubbert predicted that the world would be reaching its maximum oil production just about now. Well, if M. King Hubbert's speech was the most important speech of the last century, one might ask the question, what was the most insightful speech of the last century? Now, I don't know if these two men even knew each other. I don't know if Hyman Rickover, who I think gave the most insightful speech of the last century, don't know if he even knew that M. King Hubbert existed. He was going to talk about the same phenomenon from a very different perspective. His speech was given the 15th day of May, just a little over a year later in 1957. The audience was irrelevant, but the audience was a group of physicians in St. Paul, Minnesota. For many years, his speech was lost. And just a few years ago, it was found, and it's on the Internet now. And if you'll just Google for Rickover and energy speech, it will come up. And I'm sure that you will agree that it is probably the most prophetic speech that you have ever read. I'm sure you will agree that it might very well be the most insightful speech of the last century. I have some quotes here from Hyman Rickover's speech. And you know, I'm sure that speech was still around in 1980 when you could look back and see, gee, in 1970, we really did peak in oil production in this country, didn't we? And, you know, looking at what Hyman Rickover said, there really should have been some pause, shouldn't there? There's nothing man can do to rebuild exhausted fossil fuel reserves. They were created by solar energy. Oh, it's really interesting. Almost all the energy we use today came from or comes from the sun. It was the sun that made the plants and so forth grow that produced our gas and oil. It's the sun that, with differential heating, makes the winds blow. It's the sun that lifts the water, and the clouds then drop it on the mountains. It runs down to produce hydroelectric power. No wonder many of the ancients worshipped the sun. They kind of understood how important it was to their economy, didn't they? They were created by solar energy 500 million years ago and took eons to grow to their present volume. In the face of the basic fact that fossil fuel reserves are finite, the exact length of time these reserves will last is important in only one respect. Wow, what a profound statement he makes here. The longer they last, the more time do we have to invent ways of living off renewable or substitute energy sources and to adjust our economy to the vast changes which we can expect from such a shift. Now, this speech was given in 1957. That's more than a half century ago. This next quote, I love this next quote. Fossil fuels resemble capital in the bank. A prudent and responsible parent will use his capital sparingly in order to pass on to his children as much as possible of his inheritance. A selfish and irresponsible parent will squander it in riotous living and care not one whit how his offspring will fare. You know, I think of that statement when I notice how eager we are to drill, baby drill. Drill more, pay less. I have 10 kids, 17 grandkids, and 2 great-grandkids. When the Vice President came here to try to get me to vote to drill in Anwar, I told him I'd be happy to vote to drill in Anwar. When he promised me they were going to use all the revenues we got from Anwar to invest in alternatives. Because more than a half century ago, Hyman Rickover said that's precisely what we should be doing, and we had not been doing any of it. I noted to the Vice President that we were going to leave our kids a huge debt. I had no idea then how really huge it would be, because that was several years ago. And I said, wouldn't it be nice to leave them a little oil so that they might have something to work with that huge, huge debt? The next chart is another quote from Hyman Rickover. Whether this golden age, as he referred to it, and wow, what a golden age it's been. Whether this golden age will continue depends entirely upon our ability to keep energy supplies in balance with the needs of our growing population. Nearly 7 billion people in the world, and energy from fossil fuels, particularly oil, is absolutely essential to their survival. Possession of surplus energy is, of course, a requisite for any kind of civilization. For if man possesses merely the energy of his own muscles, he must expend all his strength, mental and physical, to obtain the bare necessities of life. When I first got some statistics on oil and the energy density of oil, I could not believe that. 1 barrel of oil has the energy equivalent of 25,000 man-hours of work. I saw that number and I said, that's incredible. That means it has as much energy in 1 barrel of oil, 42 gallons, as 12 people working all year long. I drive a Prius, and then I thought, you know, a gallon, not very big, a gallon of gasoline will take my Prius. The most recent mileage is 53 miles per gallon. Now, I could pull my Prius 53 miles, but it would take me a spell, wouldn't it? I would have to use come-alongs and hook to the guardrail or trees off to the side and pull the Prius, but it would take me quite a while to pull my Prius 50 miles, and that's just one of those 42 gallons in a barrel of oil. So I guess that 25,000 man-hours of effort is really the energy equivalent of a barrel of oil. And of course, what that incredibly cheap energy has done is to permit us to develop a really, really great quality of life. And Hyman Rickover referred to that as this golden age. The next chart, and he kind of missed it a little here, as you will see. In the 8,000 years from the beginning of history to the year 2000 AD, world population will have grown from 10 million to 4 billion, with 90%, well, we kind of passed that, the million to 4 billion, with 90%, well, we kind of passed that, didn't we? We're not quite double that, but we're past that, so growth exceeded what he thought it would be. It took the first 1,000 years of recorded history to accomplish the first doubling of population, 100 years for the last doubling. But the next doubling will require only 50 years. As a matter of fact, it required less than that. And the path we're on, you know, we're just going to have increasing numbers of people while we have decreasing supplies of energy to support them. The next chart, another quote from Hyman Rickover.